Lena stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, the hum of the shower still filling the air. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. At 34, she should be feeling fulfilled. She had a successful career, a stable marriage with David, and a beautiful home in Austin. Yet there was an emptiness inside her, a void that she couldn't quite explain, but couldn't ignore anymore. She ran a hand through her brown hair, the strands wet from the shower, and sighed deeply. There was no rational reason for her unhappiness. David loved her. They'd been together for over a decade, building their lives together. He was a good man, kind, hardworking, and completely devoted. Yet there was something missing, something she couldn't put her finger on. Every morning she woke up beside him, she wondered if this was all there was, the comfort of routine, the predictability of their life together. It was suffocating. The feeling wasn't new. Over the past few months, it had been gnawing at her. But today it felt sharper, more real. The thought of spending the rest of her life like this, stuck in a pattern of polite conversation, weekend errands, and quiet evenings in front of the TV, was starting to feel like a prison. Was this really all there was to life? Her thoughts drifted to her friends, to the ones who had children, who had embraced the chaos and mess of parenthood. It seemed like they were living in a different world, one where everything had meaning. But Lena wasn't ready for that. She had never felt the urgency to have children that so many of her friends had. The idea of diapers, sleepless nights, and the weight of responsibility, it suffocated her. She wasn't sure she could ever feel that way. She quickly dressed and walked to the kitchen, where David was already preparing coffee. He didn't notice her gaze linger for a moment longer than usual. His back was to her, absorbed in the task at hand, but Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. They had grown comfortable, and it felt safe, but it was more than that. It was as if the intimacy between them had become something distant, something faded. "Morning," David said, looking over his shoulder. His smile was warm, genuine, but it felt almost like a reflex now. She forced a smile back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She kissed his cheek, but even that felt routine. They had been like this for years. She wondered if he ever felt it too. The distance, the silence that stretched between them, even when they were in the same room. David didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't want to. He was so caught up in his work, his projects, and the endless hours he spent at the office. Lena understood, she really did. He was ambitious, driven, but it was hard not to feel neglected. They hadn't been on a real date in months. The last time they had shared a quiet evening out, just the two of them, was almost a year ago. As she sat down at the breakfast table, she noticed the clock ticking, marking the slow march of time. Another day, another week, another year. Was this how it was supposed to be? Was this the path everyone took? Graduate, work, get married, have kids, grow old, and die? Was there no more to it than this? David put a mug of coffee in front of her, and she smiled at him, grateful for his thoughtfulness. He always tried to take care of her, to make sure she had everything she needed. But what did she need, really? She didn't even know anymore. She had everything a person could want, so why did it feel like nothing? Lena took a deep breath and tried to push the thoughts away. She couldn't keep thinking like this. She had a good life, but the restlessness inside her refused to quiet down. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore anymore. It had been growing for months, a tiny voice whispering in the back of her mind, telling her there was something more, something beyond the life she had built with David. The sound of her phone buzzing broke her from her reverie. She glanced at it, half expecting it to be a work message. Instead, it was a text from Rachel, her old college roommate now living in Austin with her husband, Matt. "Coffee this afternoon? You free? I need to talk." Lena hesitated for a moment. Rachel was always there when she needed her, but what could she possibly say to her? Could she share her restlessness? Could she admit to someone that her life felt like it was slipping through her fingers no matter how hard she tried to hold on to it? But maybe that was the point. Maybe she needed someone to talk to, someone who could understand the frustration she was feeling. She typed back a quick reply. "Sure. Let's meet at the cafe at 3. As she hit send, a strange sense of relief washed over her. Maybe this conversation would be the thing she needed to help clear the fog in her mind. Or maybe it would just serve to confirm what she already knew, that she was looking for something more. When she looked up from her phone, David was already lost in his own thoughts again. She studied his face, trying to remember the man she had fallen in love with. He was still there, in the way he carried himself, in the way he cared for her. But the spark was gone. They both felt it. Neither of them knew what to do about it. Lena swallowed hard and stood up from the table. "Gotta get to work," she said, offering him a smile she didn't quite feel. David nodded, his attention already back on his phone as she walked out the door. And as the door closed behind her, Lena felt the weight of her own questions hanging in the air. How much longer could she keep pretending everything was fine when inside she was screaming for something, anything, that would make her feel alive again? Lena sat at her desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard as she stared at the screen, the numbers and charts blurring in front of her eyes. The office was buzzing around her, a constant hum of voices, ringing phones and clicking keyboards. But her mind was elsewhere, lost in the endless cycle of thoughts she couldn't seem to escape. She glanced at the clock, almost time for lunch. Maybe the distraction would help. She stood, pushing her chair back with a soft squeak, and made her way to the elevator. The familiar routine was comforting in a way, but it no longer brought the same sense of purpose it once did. It was as if something in her was quietly rebelling, pulling her toward something else. When she entered the lobby, she saw him. Jackson. He was standing near the entrance, leaning casually against the wall, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't looking at her, but his presence was undeniable. There was something magnetic about him, something that immediately drew her in. She had seen him in the office before, but today was different. Today, there was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself. It was a quiet confidence that she couldn't ignore. For a moment, she froze. She felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest, a quickened heartbeat that startled her. Her first instinct was to look away, to act like everything was normal. But there was something in his gaze that pulled her back. Lena didn't know what to do with this feeling. She had been married for 12 years, but something about Jackson felt different. It wasn't just his good looks, though that was undeniable. It was the way he seemed to be completely at ease in his own skin, the way he moved with an effortless charm that made Lena feel as if she was the only person in the room. She took a breath and forced herself to walk past him. As she did, she felt his eyes on her. She tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. She could feel the weight of his gaze, almost like a gentle pressure against her skin. Her pulse quickened. What was happening to her? "Hey, Lena," Jackson said, his voice smooth, almost playful. She turned to face him, caught off guard. "Oh, hi, Jackson," she replied, forcing a smile, though she could feel the awkwardness creeping in. What was she supposed to say? What was happening to her? She wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not about someone else. Not now. "Going to grab lunch?" Jackson asked, his eyes lighting up with a mischievous glint. Lena hesitated. She should just go alone, like she always did. It wasn't that she didn't enjoy Jackson's company. It was just that it felt wrong, like some kind of unspoken boundary was being crossed. She was married. She had a life. And yet, standing here in front of him, the world outside felt distant, irrelevant. "Yeah, I was just about to head out," Lena said, trying to keep her voice steady. She didn't want to come off as desperate, or worse, like she was entertaining thoughts she shouldn't be. "I'm going to the cafe down the street." "Mind if I join you?" Jackson's smile was playful, but there was something else in his expression, something that made Lena's heart race a little faster. She opened her mouth to decline, but before she could speak, he added, "I promise I'm not trying to steal you away from your lunch break. Just thought it might be nice to have some company." His words were light, but his tone held a certain depth to it, something she couldn't quite place. Against her better judgment, Lena nodded. Sure, why not? As they stepped out into the warm Austin afternoon, Lena felt an odd mixture of excitement and guilt. The air felt thicker, more charged somehow. They walked side by side, the silence between them both comfortable and electric. "So, how's work going?" Jackson asked casually as they approached the cafe. "Busy, same old," Lena replied, her voice betraying the truth she wasn't willing to admit. She wasn't sure what she was doing anymore. "You?" "Same here," Jackson said, his eyes glinting with something she couldn't quite read. "But I've been thinking, you know? It's easy to get caught up in the grind and forget to actually live." He paused, looking at her. "You ever feel like that? Like you're just going through the motions?" Lena swallowed hard. She hadn't expected the question to hit so close to home. She nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, I do. More often than I'd like to admit." They sat down at a quiet table in the corner of the cafe, the noise of the city just outside their small bubble. As the conversation continued, Lena felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a connection. It wasn't just the flirtation that tingled in the air between them, it was something deeper. Jackson seemed to understand her in a way no one else did. He saw the cracks beneath her surface, the doubts, the unspoken desires. It felt exhilarating. It felt new. And then, without warning, Lena found herself laughing, a genuine laugh, one that seemed to come from a place she had forgotten existed. Jackson's smile grew wider as he leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto hers. There was a warmth in his gaze, a certain intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "See?" Jackson said softly, his voice low. "Life's too short to live in a box. You deserve to feel this way more often." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what she was supposed to say, or even if she should say anything at all. The connection between them was undeniable, and yet it was dangerous. It was a path she wasn't sure she should walk down, but now that she had taken the first step, she wasn't sure she could turn back. As they finished their lunch, Lena's mind raced. This was just the beginning, she knew, but what did it mean? What did it all mean? The days after lunch with Jackson felt heavy, like a secret lurking in the quiet corners of her mind. Lena had returned to her life, her routine, but everything felt different. The moment she had shared with him, the electric charge in the air, seemed to pulse in her thoughts with an intensity she couldn't shake. Every time she glanced at her phone, her heart skipped a beat, half expecting a text from him. But there was nothing, and that bothered her. She didn't know why it bothered her, but it did. She should have been relieved that Jackson hadn't messaged her. It was just lunch, just a conversation between two people passing time. Yet, as the hours stretched into days, Lena found herself caught between guilt and curiosity. What was she doing? She had been married to David for over 12 years. She loved him, didn't she? And yet, the spark she once felt seemed to be extinguished, leaving only a hollowed-out version of the woman she had once been. Every morning she woke up beside him, and while he kissed her forehead and asked about her day, the words felt rehearsed, like a script they had long memorized. She pushed the thought away as she arrived home that evening, the familiar feeling of exhaustion settling in. The house was quiet, just as it always was. David was at the kitchen table, focused on his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. He barely looked up as she entered. "Hey," he said absently, his eyes never leaving the screen. Lena stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. She could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator, the clicking of the keys as David typed away, immersed in his work. She felt invisible, a ghost drifting in and out of his world. The silence between them was thick, like an unspoken understanding that neither of them wanted to confront. "I'll make dinner soon," she said, her voice sounding strangely distant even to herself. David nodded but didn't respond. Lena turned away, retreating to the kitchen. As she moved around the space, she tried to focus on the task at hand, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Jackson. How was it possible that a few hours with him could unravel so much of what she thought she knew about herself? Her phone buzzed and she froze. For a split second she thought it might be him, Jackson. But when she glanced at the screen, it was just a notification from work. Her heart sank, the momentary flutter of hope dissolving into nothing. She took a deep breath and continued cooking, but she couldn't shake the feeling of something missing. The emptiness inside her wasn't just about David anymore. It was about herself, about how disconnected she felt from everything around her. Dinner was quiet, just like every night. David ate, his focus still on his laptop, occasionally offering a comment about something he had read or a new development at work. But Lena couldn't engage. Her mind was elsewhere, on the spark she had felt with Jackson, on the pull she couldn't ignore. As they finished eating, Lena cleared the dishes, the clink of plates against the sink louder than it should have been. She tried to make herself busy, to drown out the noise in her head, but it wasn't working. Her thoughts were on Jackson. The way he had looked at her that day, the way his smile seemed to make the world slow down just for a moment. David stood up and walked to the living room, muttering something about an early meeting the next day. Lena nodded, but the gesture felt mechanical, like a reflex she didn't even think about anymore. She retreated to the bedroom, hoping to at least find some peace there. But as she slipped under the covers, her mind refused to quiet. Her thoughts swirled. She couldn't stop thinking about how easy it had been to talk to Jackson, how comfortable it had felt. There was no effort, no awkward pauses, no pressure. With David, there was always a weight between them, a pressure to keep things normal, to keep things from falling apart. Lena tossed and turned, the feeling of guilt mingling with a growing desire for something more. She wanted to feel alive again. She wanted to feel seen. She wanted to break free from the cage of routine and responsibility that had built up around her over the years. But she didn't know what to do. She couldn't just walk away from everything she had built with David. Could she? The thought of it seemed impossible, but there was a yearning inside her, a spark that she couldn't ignore. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how fragile everything was. Her marriage, her identity, the life she had worked so hard to create, all of it felt like it was teetering on the edge. Lena closed her eyes, trying to will the thoughts away. But instead she imagined Jackson's face again, his eyes, his smile. She couldn't help it. There was something about him that had awakened something inside her, something that had been dormant for far too long. And in that moment, she wasn't sure which scared her more, the thought of losing everything or the thought of never feeling this way again. Lena sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clenched tightly together in her lap. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the background seemed to fill the space between her and David, the silence growing louder with each passing second. She had just come home from work, but the familiar comfort of her apartment felt foreign. She felt like an intruder in her own life. David was in the kitchen, doing what he always did in the evenings, preparing a simple meal. He hummed a tune to himself, unaware of the storm brewing inside Lena. She watched him for a moment, her chest tight with a mix of guilt and longing. How could everything feel so off when nothing had changed? She had everything she ever thought she wanted. A career she had built from the ground up, a husband who loved her, and a home filled with memories. And yet, every day the emptiness grew. The silence between them seemed to echo, louder and louder, each time she tried to fill it with her own words. She wanted to scream, but the words stuck in her throat. She stood up, walking to the kitchen, her movements mechanical, as if she were going through the motions of a life that no longer felt like hers. She didn't know how to fix it, didn't know how to go back to the way things were. It was as if something inside her had cracked, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't put the pieces back together. David looked up from the stove, his face lighting up with a smile. "Hey, how was your day?" His voice was warm, but Lena couldn't shake the feeling that it was all just a performance. His eyes were kind, but distant. His smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. "Fine," she replied, her voice sounding hollow to her own ears. She forced a smile, but it didn't feel real. "Busy, you know." David nodded and turned back to the stove, but Lena couldn't bring herself to keep pretending. Not anymore. She opened her mouth, ready to say something, anything to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? How could she explain what was happening inside her? The truth was, she didn't even know what was happening inside her. All she knew was that the emptiness, the longing, had taken root deep within her, and no matter how much she tried to ignore it, it wouldn't go away. It was Jackson. The spark, the connection she had felt with him, had awakened something she thought was long gone. She had never meant for it to happen, never imagined that one conversation, one look could send her spiraling. But here she was, unable to stop thinking about him, unable to stop the pull she felt toward him. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward David. How could she feel this way? How could she want something, or someone, else when she had a husband who loved her? What kind of person did that make her? She hated herself for even thinking it. The guilt gnawed at her, but the desire, the craving for something more, was too strong to ignore. David placed a plate of food in front of her, his face still holding that same warm, patient expression. He sat down across from her, waiting for her to dig in. But Lena couldn't bring herself to touch the food. How could she when her mind was consumed with thoughts of Jackson? "You okay?" David asked, his voice laced with concern. Lena couldn't help but flinch at the question. She could see it in his eyes. He noticed the distance. He had to. How could he not? But instead of asking, instead of confronting her about the growing rift between them, he just ignored it. "I'm fine," she lied. She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for months, maybe even longer. But how could she tell him the truth? How could she tell him that she felt invisible, that she longed for something she couldn't name, that every moment felt like a weight she couldn't bear? She had no answers, and maybe she didn't want to face them. The silence stretched between them again, and Lena felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill over. She blinked them away, determined not to let them fall. Not here, not in front of David. She picked up her fork, moving it absent-mindedly, but the food tasted like nothing. It was just another part of the routine, another task to check off on the never-ending list of things to do. But it wasn't enough anymore. Nothing was enough. A part of her screamed at herself, telling her she was being selfish, that she had everything anyone could want. How could she even consider letting it all go? But another part of her, the part that had been silenced for so long, told her it wasn't about what she had. It was about what she needed, what she wanted. And right now, she didn't know what that was. But she knew deep down it wasn't just about Jackson. It was about her, about finding herself again, about feeling alive. It wasn't about leaving David, but it was about something bigger, something she couldn't even put into words. The guilt crashed over her like a wave, threatening to drown her. She should be grateful. She should be content. She should be happy. But the truth was, she didn't know how to be any of those things anymore. She placed her fork down, her appetite lost. "David," she began, her voice quiet, unsure. He looked up, his expression still warm, still patient, but there was something else in his eyes, something he hadn't acknowledged yet. "Do you ever feel—" She hesitated, trying to find the words. "Do you ever feel like we're just going through the motions? Like we're not really living anymore?" David's smile faltered for just a second before he nodded, though his eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "I guess we all get busy sometimes." Lena looked down at her hands, clenching them again. The words she needed to say were still stuck, caught in her throat. How could she make him understand? How could she explain the storm inside her, the conflict that seemed to tear her apart? She had no answers, but she knew one thing for sure. The conflict inside her was only just beginning. Lena sat at her desk, staring blankly at the spreadsheet on her computer screen. The numbers blurred together as her thoughts drifted once again to Jackson. She had promised herself she wouldn't let him consume her. She told herself it was just a fleeting moment, nothing more than an innocent connection. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. It felt like more. The more she tried to push the thoughts of him away, the stronger they became. The conversation, his smile, the way he looked at her, it all haunted her. There was a tension in her chest, a restlessness she couldn't shake. She couldn't tell anyone, couldn't admit it to herself even. But it was there. It was undeniable. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her reverie. It was a message from Jackson. Her heart skipped a beat. "Hey, Lena, I know we've both been busy, but I was wondering if you'd want to grab coffee sometime this week. Maybe catch up a bit?" Lena felt a rush of excitement and guilt at the same time. She stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had every intention of saying no. She was married. She had a life, responsibilities, a home, a husband who trusted her. She had promised herself that she wouldn't let this happen. But then, she thought of the conversation they had shared. How easy it had been to talk to him, how alive she had felt in his presence. She hadn't felt that in so long. Her fingers typed before she could stop herself. "Sure, I'd like that. How about tomorrow afternoon?" As soon as she sent the message, a sense of dread washed over her. What was she doing? She had crossed a line and she knew it, but there was something inside her, something deep and raw that kept pushing her forward. The next day, as she walked into the coffee shop, Lena felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She was already here, already committed. There was no turning back now. The moment she stepped inside, her eyes immediately found Jackson sitting at a corner table, a cup of coffee in front of him, his eyes scanning the room. He looked up as she walked toward him, and that same spark, warmth, interest, flickered in his gaze. For a moment, everything else faded away. It was just the two of them, as if no one else existed. "Lena," Jackson greeted her, his voice smooth, almost playful. "I was starting to think you'd bail on me." "I almost did," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. "But here I am." She sat down across from him, her hands fidgeting nervously with the hem of her sleeve. The air between them was charged, filled with an energy she couldn't ignore. There was an intensity in Jackson's eyes, something more than just casual curiosity. "I'm glad you came," Jackson said, leaning back slightly in his chair. "I've been meaning to talk to you again. It's hard to find time with everything going on, but I think we should talk." Lena nodded, unsure of what to say next. She had no idea where this conversation was going, but she felt a strange pull, an urgency that had been missing in her life for too long. "I've been thinking about you," Jackson continued, his voice lowering, the words dripping with sincerity. "About our last conversation. It's hard not to think about how easily we connected." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to pull away, wanted to deny everything she was feeling, but she couldn't. She was too far gone. I don't know what's happening," Lena admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been married for 12 years. I love my husband, but lately I just don't feel like myself anymore." Jackson's gaze softened, and for a moment he was quiet. He seemed to understand. "You don't have to explain yourself to me, Lena. I get it. You're not the first person to feel this way. Sometimes we just need something different, something that makes us feel seen, alive." Lena swallowed hard, the words settling into her chest like a heavy weight. She had never spoken these truths aloud before. She had never admitted how hollow she felt, how disconnected she had become from everything around her. The idea of her life, of her marriage, had become so routine, so predictable, that she couldn't remember the last time she had truly felt alive. "You're not alone in this," Jackson said, leaning forward slightly. "We all need someone to remind us of who we are. Sometimes it's easy to forget." His words resonated deep within her, and Lena felt a mixture of fear and longing. This wasn't just a casual meeting. This was something more, and she was afraid she didn't know how to stop it. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. The noise of the cafe, the chatter, the clinking of mugs, all faded into the background. It was just her and Jackson. His presence filled the space between them, and she couldn't ignore the magnetic pull he had on her. She didn't want to ignore it. "I can't keep doing this," Lena whispered, more to herself than to him. "I don't know what's happening, but I can't pretend anymore." Jackson's eyes darkened slightly, as if he understood the gravity of her words. "You don't have to pretend, Lena. Just be honest with yourself. It's okay to feel what you're feeling." And for the first time in a long while, Lena felt something she hadn't in months: hope. But it was a dangerous kind of hope, the kind that led you down paths you weren't sure you could return from. As they continued talking, Lena found herself opening up more than she ever had before. She didn't know what she was looking for, but in Jackson's presence, she felt like she was finally starting to find herself again. She didn't know what this meant, but she knew she couldn't stop it now. Lena couldn't stop thinking about the conversation she'd had with Jackson. Even as she tried to focus on work, every interaction with him replayed in her mind. His words, his laughter, the way he had looked at her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. She couldn't deny it anymore. Something between them was growing, and it was impossible to ignore. The days following their coffee meeting passed in a blur, but Jackson's messages were constant, like small sparks in the dark. He didn't push her, didn't ask too much, but each message was a thread that pulled her deeper into the web they were weaving together. Sometimes it was a simple text. "Hope your day's going well." Other times it was something more, a suggestion to meet, to talk, to share a part of themselves that had been buried for too long. Lena felt herself gravitating toward him like a magnet drawn by an unseen force. It wasn't just physical attraction, it was the connection, the way he seemed to understand her in a way no one else did. She could talk to him without pretense, without fear of judgment. With Jackson, she didn't have to pretend to be the perfect wife, the perfect employee, the perfect woman. He saw her for who she was, and somehow that made her feel more alive. One evening, after another quiet dinner with David, Lena found herself staring at her phone once more. She was supposed to be doing a final check on a work report, but her mind kept drifting. "I can't stop thinking about you," the message from Jackson read, simple but powerful. Her heart skipped. She knew she should ignore it, should shut it down, but the words made her pulse race. It was like a secret being shared, something forbidden but impossible to resist. She had felt this way before in the early days of her relationship with David, but it was different now. It was raw, unfiltered. "I can't stop thinking about you either," she typed back before she could stop herself. She stared at the message before sending it, the words feeling both freeing and terrifying at the same time. The reply came quickly. "Let's meet tomorrow. Same place. Coffee? I just need to see you again." Lena felt her breath catch. She didn't know what she was doing anymore. She had crossed a line, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized how deeply she had stepped into something she wasn't sure she could get out of. But the need to see him again was overpowering. The next afternoon, she walked into the cafe with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. She spotted Jackson right away. He was sitting at the same corner table looking out the window, as if he had been waiting for her. The moment their eyes met, a wave of warmth washed over her. She walked over, heart pounding, every step filled with uncertainty and longing. "Hey," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Hey," Jackson replied with that same smile that made her knees weak. "You look good." Lena forced a smile, trying to ignore the way his words made her feel. "Thanks," she said, sitting down across from him. The air between them was thick, charged with something neither of them could deny. "How's everything?" Jackson asked, leaning forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. Lena swallowed hard. She wanted to say something, wanted to explain how she felt, but the words wouldn't come. It wasn't just about David anymore. It was about her, about how she felt, how lost she had been, how much she longed for something real. She didn't know what that was, but Jackson was the only one who had made her feel anything close to it. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to explain it. It's like I've been sleepwalking through my life and I just woke up. And now everything feels different." Jackson nodded, his expression soft. "I get that. I feel the same way. It's like we're both stuck in our own ways, but here, right now, this moment, it feels real, doesn't it?" Lena's breath caught in her throat. It did feel real. She had been hiding from herself for so long, too afraid to confront the emptiness inside. But with Jackson, it was like she didn't have to hide anymore. She didn't have to pretend. "You make me feel alive," she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Jackson's eyes darkened slightly, and for a moment the world around them seemed to disappear. "You make me feel the same way, Lena." Lena's heart was racing now, the space between them growing smaller with each passing second. She wanted to pull away, to put a stop to this before it went any further, but she couldn't. She didn't want to. Their conversation flowed easily after that, the words slipping between them like water finding its way through cracks. They shared stories, laughed about things they had never told anyone else, and in that small bubble, Lena felt seen. She felt understood in a way she hadn't in years. Before they knew it, the afternoon was slipping away, and they both reluctantly stood up, knowing they had to go back to their separate lives. But as they stepped out into the fading light of the day, Lena felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was something more, something she didn't know how to handle but couldn't turn away from. Jackson reached out, his hand brushing against hers for a second before he let go. "I'll be thinking about you," he said softly, his voice filled with meaning. Lena smiled, her heart racing. "I'll be thinking about you, too." As they parted ways, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than either of them had expected. But with each passing moment, it was becoming harder to imagine walking away. Lena could feel the weight of David's eyes on her as they sat at the dinner table. The clinking of their silverware sounded louder than usual, sharp and jarring, as if every sound between them was amplified by the silence that stretched thin. She forced herself to chew, to swallow, but her throat felt tight, as if her body knew the truth before her mind did. It had been happening for weeks now, this growing sense of distance between them, and she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that David was starting to see the cracks, too. He had been different lately, more present, more watchful. His gaze, once kind and full of the easy trust that had formed the foundation of their marriage, now seemed to linger a moment too long, as if he was searching for something. It unsettled Lena, made her feel exposed, as if he could see through the mask she was wearing. He had always been intuitive, but lately it felt like his senses were sharper, catching things that she thought she had hidden. "How was your day?" David asked, his voice soft but carrying an edge of something unfamiliar. Lena hesitated. She had become a master at deflecting, at offering enough to keep things afloat without diving too deep into the truth. But tonight something felt off. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It was fine," she said, her voice sounding hollow even to her. "Busy, you know? Work, meetings, the usual." David nodded, but there was a pause, an uncomfortable one. He put his fork down and looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink. "Lena," he began, his voice quieter now, tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "Are you okay? You've been distant lately." Lena's heart skipped. She swallowed, the words trapped in her chest. She had been so careful, so cautious, but she could feel the noose tightening around her. The walls she had built between herself and the truth were crumbling, and no matter how hard she tried to hold on to them, the cracks were becoming too wide to ignore. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice betraying her. It was a reflex, the lie she had become so used to, but the moment it left her lips she regretted it. David studied her, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. "You sure?" He paused as if weighing the sincerity of her words. "Because, Lena, it feels like you're pulling away from me, like you've got something on your mind. I know you, I can tell when something's wrong." Lena's stomach churned. She didn't know what to say. The guilt was overwhelming, suffocating. She wanted to tell him the truth, but how could she? How could she explain the emptiness she had been running from, the secret meetings with Jackson that had been feeding the hunger she couldn't satiate? How could she tell him that she was falling into something she couldn't control, and that it wasn't him, but something inside her that had been broken for far too long? "I'm just tired," she said finally, offering a smile that felt brittle, fragile. "Work's been a lot lately. You know how it is." David's gaze didn't soften. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. She could see the doubt creeping in, the suspicion that had begun to form. It was there, hovering just beneath the surface, and Lena couldn't ignore it. "I know something's been off," David said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know what it is, but I can feel it. It's like you're somewhere else, and I don't know how to reach you anymore." Lena's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to tell him everything, to apologize for what she had done, for how far she had let things go. But the words wouldn't come. They were trapped inside her, choking her, suffocating her. "I'm not going anywhere," she finally managed to say, her voice small, fragile. She reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. It felt like a gesture meant to reassure, but even she didn't believe it. "I'm right here." David looked down at her hand, his expression unreadable. There was a moment of silence, and then he pulled his hand away, slowly, deliberately. Lena's heart sank. The warmth she had felt just a second ago seemed to evaporate, leaving behind an icy chill. "I hope that's true," he said quietly, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Because it doesn't feel that way." Lena watched him, her breath catching in her throat. His words hung in the air between them like a shadow that refused to leave. She could see it now. The suspicion was there, in the way he was looking at her, in the way he was pulling back. He knew something wasn't right. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to make him question everything. She could feel the walls closing in, the space between them widening, and she had no idea how to fix it. The guilt gnawed at her, but so did the longing, the desire for something more, something she couldn't find in her marriage, and it was destroying her, little by little. David pushed his chair back, standing up. "I'm going to bed," he said, his voice flat. "We'll talk tomorrow." Lena watched him walk away, her chest tightening, her heart aching with a mix of fear and regret. She knew the damage was done, and no matter how much she tried to deny it, no matter how much she tried to convince herself that things could go back to the way they were, she knew she was losing him, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stood in the doorway of the living room, staring at the unopened envelope in her hands. The moment felt surreal, almost as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She had been avoiding it for days, but now it was here. The truth. The very thing she had been running from, the thing she had feared. She could hear David in the other room, moving about, his footsteps heavier than usual. His presence was different now, distant, guarded. There was no pretense left between them. He had started to notice, to question. Lena squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, bracing herself. She knew the envelope was from the detective David had hired. It had been a quiet, nagging suspicion of hers, one she had pushed aside, but now it was real. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, threatening to crush the fragile facade she had so carefully maintained. The conversation from last night echoed in her mind. "I know something's been off." David's voice, calm but filled with an edge she couldn't ignore. "It feels like you're pulling away from me." His suspicion, once a quiet murmur, was now louder, more insistent. With trembling fingers, Lena opened the envelope. The first thing she saw was a photograph. Her breath caught in her throat. It was her. She was walking into a cafe, alone, but there was no mistake. This was the day she had met Jackson, the day the spark between them had ignited. Her pulse quickened as she flipped through the photos, each one more damning than the last. There was the photo of her leaving the cafe, a hesitant smile on her lips, and there, in another picture, was Jackson, his hand on her back guiding her out the door, closer than any friend should be. She dropped the photos onto the coffee table, feeling as if the room had suddenly closed in around her. Her chest ached as she held her breath, trying to steady herself, to quiet the storm that was raging inside her. How could she have let this happen? The guilt gnawed at her, but there was no undoing it now. The truth was out there in black and white, in a series of images that told a story she had hoped to keep buried. David's footsteps grew louder as he approached the living room. He was coming. She could hear him, feel the weight of his gaze on her, even though he wasn't yet in the room. The guilt was suffocating, thick in the air between them like a living thing. She had a choice now, to confess, to finally admit the truth, or to try to keep lying. But her heart knew there was no way to run anymore. She had been found out. When David entered, he didn't say a word at first. His eyes immediately found the photos spread out on the coffee table, and the silence between them stretched painfully long. Lena stood there, her throat tight, her heart thudding in her chest, unsure if she could even breathe. "I didn't want to do this, Lena," David said finally, his voice low but steady. "But I had to know. I had to know if it was true." Lena's breath hitched. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes, the disappointment that was already there. He had found the truth, and she had no choice now but to face it. "I'm sorry," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for this to happen." David took a step closer, his eyes dark with a mixture of anger and sadness. "How long, Lena?" His voice cracked slightly, as if the weight of the question was too much for him to bear. "How long has this been going on?" Lena opened her mouth to answer, but the words stuck. How long? Was it just the meeting with Jackson that had sparked everything? Or had the cracks in her marriage been forming for much longer? She had always known something was missing, but she never thought it would come to this. "I don't know," she said softly, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. It started with a conversation, and then it just happened. I don't know how to explain it." David's jaw tightened as he looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to explain it, Lena. I can see it all here. The pictures don't lie. But what I don't understand is why. Why would you do this, after everything we've been through?" Lena's eyes filled with tears. "I don't have an answer for that. I've been lost, David, and I thought for a moment that this," she gestured to the photos, to everything she had done, "would make me feel alive again. But it didn't. It just made everything worse." David shook his head, his hands clenched at his sides. "You're right. It did make everything worse." His voice dropped to a whisper, the pain seeping through his words. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Lena. I don't know if I can trust you again." Lena felt a sob rise in her chest, but she fought it back. "Please, David. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you." "I don't know if you did," David replied, his eyes filling with tears. "But the truth is, you have, and I don't know how to fix it." Lena took a step toward him, but he backed away, his gaze never leaving hers. The space between them felt like an entire lifetime. "Maybe I can't fix it," she said softly, her voice trembling, "but I'll do whatever it takes to try." David was silent for a long time, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for something. Some sign that she truly understood the weight of what she had done. But the truth was clear now. There was no going back. The damage had been done, and no matter how much she wanted to, Lena knew she couldn't undo the past. The silence between Lena and David had grown unbearable. It was thick, suffocating, wrapping itself around her like a heavy blanket. Every glance, every word felt like it was weighted with suspicion, hurt, and betrayal. She had always prided herself on being able to keep control, to maintain a sense of order in her life. But now everything was spiraling out of control. She sat on the edge of their bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for the storm that she knew was coming. David was pacing in the living room, his movements sharp and erratic. He hadn't said a word to her since their earlier conversation. She could hear the sound of his breath, heavy and measured, as he tried to hold himself together. But she knew better. He was breaking, just like her. Her phone buzzed and Lena glanced at the screen. It was a message from Jackson. The same mix of guilt and longing stirred in her chest, and for a moment she was lost in the thought of him. But she forced herself to push it away. She couldn't do this anymore, couldn't keep balancing these two lives. The cost of it was too high, and David deserved better. Lena's thoughts were interrupted when she heard David's footsteps in the hall. He was coming. The time had come. There was no more running, no more pretending. The door opened, and David stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes darker than she had ever seen them. He didn't look at her, not at first. Instead, he walked over to the table where the photos had been laid out earlier. He picked one up, his hand shaking slightly, and stared at it. His face contorted with emotion, a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Lena," he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. "What the hell is this? How long have you been seeing him?" The words landed like a punch to the gut. Lena opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, feel the accusation in the air. She could see the pain written across his face, and it tore at her. She had never wanted to hurt him, but now she could see it clearly. She had. I didn't mean for this to happen," Lena whispered, the words feeling like a hollow apology. It wasn't enough. Nothing could undo what she had done. David's eyes flicked to hers, and in that moment, everything between them shattered. "You didn't mean for it to happen? Then why did it? Why did you let it go this far?" His voice rose, sharp and cutting. "I trusted you, Lena. I trusted you with everything I had, and you—" His breath caught in his throat, as if the words were too painful to speak. "How could you do this to me?" Lena felt the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. She had wanted to explain, to make him understand. But the truth was, she didn't even understand it herself. There was no justification, no reason that would make sense. She had been running from herself, from the life she had built, from the loneliness she had felt for so long. But now, looking at David, seeing the anguish in his eyes, she realized the true cost of her actions. "I don't know," Lena said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how it happened, but it did, and I can't take it back." David slammed the photo down on the table with a force that made Lena flinch. "No, you can't, and neither can I." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Lena's chest tightened as she tried to find the words to fix it, to make things right. But she couldn't. There was nothing left to say. David's eyes were filled with a fury she had never seen in him before. "I've been working my ass off for this family, Lena. I've been trying to build something for us, and all you've done is tear it apart. You've been sneaking around behind my back, living a lie, and for what? A damn affair?" Lena felt tears begin to well up in her eyes. She wanted to speak, wanted to defend herself, but the guilt was suffocating. The words wouldn't come. David took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but his voice still trembled. "I don't know how to look at you anymore. I don't know how to be with someone who has betrayed me like this. I don't even know who you are anymore." Lena reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to touch his arm. "Please, David," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lose you." David stepped back, pulling away from her touch as if the very contact burned him. "You don't get it, do you? You can't just say sorry and expect everything to go back to normal. You can't just undo what you've done. The trust is gone, Lena, and once it's gone, it doesn't come back." Lena's breath hitched as she fought back the tears. She had ruined everything. She had destroyed the one thing that had mattered most to her. David, their life, their love. "I didn't want to lose you," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make it right." David stood there for a moment, his face a mixture of anger and sorrow. Then he shook his head slowly, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of everything was too much to bear. "I don't think you can," he whispered. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Lena standing there, shattered and broken, her heart in pieces at her feet. Lena sat in the dim light of the living room, the weight of David's words still hanging heavy in the air. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. The silence was suffocating, each passing second stretching into what felt like an eternity. It had been hours since David walked out of their room, but his absence felt like a presence, silent, looming, unbearable. She had spent so much time running, avoiding, pretending, fooling herself into thinking that she could keep the fragments of her life from falling apart. But now, here they were, scattered and broken on the floor, impossible to piece together. She had betrayed him. She had destroyed everything they had built. The guilt gnawed at her relentlessly. She closed her eyes, feeling the sting of the tears that refused to fall. How had it come to this? She had told herself it would never happen, that she would never betray him, but she had. And now, David had walked away. His trust in her was gone, and nothing she could say or do would bring it back. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, her heart tightening as she saw the name that had been haunting her. Jackson. She stared at the message for a long moment, her fingers trembling as she considered how to respond. His words were simple, almost too innocent. "Thinking of you. I hope you're okay." But was she okay? She wasn't sure she had ever been less okay than she was in this moment. She had sought something in Jackson, something she hadn't even known she was looking for, but it had come at a price she couldn't afford, and now she was faced with the consequences. The life she had built with David, the love they had shared, it was all slipping through her fingers. Lena set the phone down, a finality to the action that felt like the closing of a door. She couldn't keep living in two worlds. She couldn't keep pretending. She had to make a choice. Her mind flashed to the days before everything had started to fall apart, the days when she had felt hopeful, full of ambition, looking toward a future with David. She had loved him. She had promised him a life together. And yet something inside her had cracked. She hadn't wanted to face the truth of her own unhappiness, so she had found an escape in Jackson. But now there was no escaping the reality of what she had done. David was right. She had betrayed him. She had torn apart the foundation of their relationship with a lie, and she couldn't undo it. But was there still a way forward? Was there a way to repair what had been broken? Lena knew that the answer wouldn't be easy. Trust, once shattered, was nearly impossible to rebuild. But she also knew that she couldn't live in the shadow of her own mistakes. She couldn't keep running from the consequences. With a deep breath, she stood up, her legs shaky beneath her. Her gaze moved to the door where David had left earlier, and she felt a pang of fear. Was it too late to fix this? Was it too late to ask for forgiveness? She crossed the room, each step heavier than the last as she approached the door. She needed to see him. She needed to face him, to tell him the truth of how deeply sorry she was and how much she regretted everything. Lena opened the door, and the cool evening air hit her face like a slap. The world outside was still, quiet, but it felt as though it had shifted too. She stepped out onto the porch, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't know where to go. David's car was parked in the driveway. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the light inside the living room flicker. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what she would find, but the door was still open, waiting for her to walk through it. She walked toward the car, her hand shaking as she reached for the door handle, but before she could open it, she heard his voice. "I know you're out here," David said, his tone low but steady. Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to face him, her heart racing in her chest. David was standing just inside the doorway, his eyes watching her, waiting for her to say something. Anything. The air between them felt charged, and she knew that the moment had come. She had to make a choice. She could walk away and let the damage be done, or she could face the truth, confront her mistakes, and take responsibility. She took a step toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. "David," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I've hurt you, but I can't lose you. I can't lose everything we've built." David's face softened, but there was still a distance in his eyes, a wall between them that hadn't been there before. He didn't say anything for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her, as though he were searching for something, an answer, an explanation, or maybe just a sign that she was truly sorry. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said quietly, the words weighing heavy on both of them. "But I can't make this decision alone. I need time to think. I need time to figure out if we can ever be fixed." Lena nodded, the tears finally falling as she realized the gravity of his words. She had torn everything apart, and now it was up to her to face the consequences. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way back. But it wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. With a final aching glance, she turned and walked back inside. She had made her choice. Now she had to live with it. The days following their conversation felt like an endless ache, a raw, unhealed wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Lena woke up each morning with the same heavy weight in her chest, the guilt and regret settling into her bones like a permanent fixture. She hadn't heard from David. He was there in the house, but it felt as if he were miles away. She tried to occupy herself, to push through the motions of her day, but every task felt empty. She couldn't concentrate on anything. Her mind constantly wandered back to that moment, the moment she had seen the devastation in David's eyes. The pain was etched into his face, something she couldn't erase, something that no apology could heal. Lena sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee in front of her, the steam rising like the last remnants of her hopes for forgiveness. It had been days, and the silence between them had grown unbearable. The house, once filled with the sound of laughter, of shared moments, now felt like a tomb. She had tried to call him, tried to reach out, but David hadn't answered. Not a single text, not a single word. He had shut himself off from her, and she couldn't blame him. How could she? She had betrayed him in the worst way possible, and now she was paying the price. The guilt was suffocating, making it harder and harder to breathe. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message notification. It was from her mother. "I hope you're okay. I'm here if you need to talk." Lena stared at the message, her hands trembling as she typed out a response. She didn't even know what to say anymore. Her life felt like it was falling apart, and she had no idea how to fix it. She put the phone down, not knowing what to do with herself. Her gaze moved to the window, the sky outside a dull gray. It matched her mood perfectly. The world kept turning, kept moving, but she was stuck in a moment that felt like it would never end. Lena stood up and walked to the living room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. David's things were still here, his coat hanging by the door, his shoes lined up neatly on the mat. The house felt like a reflection of the man she had betrayed. It was a ghost of the life they had built together, and she wasn't sure if it could ever be restored. She sank down onto the couch, feeling the weight of everything crash over her. She had never felt so alone in her life. She had pushed him away, driven him to a breaking point, and now she couldn't undo it. The consequences of her actions were too real, too final. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping when she saw David's name. Without thinking, she answered, her voice shaky. "David?" There was a long pause before he spoke, his voice strained, distant. "Lena, I need to talk to you." Her heart raced, a mix of fear and hope flooding her chest. She had been waiting for this moment, desperate for him to reach out, to tell her that they could still fix things. But the tone of his voice, the coldness in his words, told her everything she needed to know. "I'm not sure what you want me to say," he continued. "I've been thinking about everything, about us, and I don't know if I can ever forgive you for what you've done." Lena's throat tightened, the words barely coming out. "David, please. I am so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lose you." But his voice was quieter now, filled with a sadness that made her heart break. "You've already lost me, Lena, and I don't know how to find my way back." The finality in his words hit her like a punch to the gut. He was done. He had made his decision. He had already started to let go, and she had no way of stopping it. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling, "please, don't leave me. Don't give up on us." "I can't keep living like this," he said, his voice cold. "I need space. I need to figure out if I can ever trust you again." Lena felt the floor beneath her begin to crumble. It wasn't just the marriage that was falling apart. It was her entire world. The man she had loved, the man she had promised her life to, was slipping through her fingers, and she had no way of holding on. "I'll give you space," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I'll do whatever it takes. But please know I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." David didn't respond. He didn't say anything else before hanging up, leaving her in the silence once again. The phone slipped from her hand as she sank back onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. The guilt weighed on her like a 1,000-pound boulder, crushing her, suffocating her. She had lost him. She had lost everything. There was no going back now. Lena stared at the phone, the words she wanted to say hanging in the air, unspoken. But it was too late. The decision had already been made, and no matter how much she wished it could be undone, the truth was clear. She had lost David. Lena stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, worn, broken, hollowed out by the weight of her own decisions. She had spent so long running from herself, from the emptiness inside, that she had forgotten who she was. The face in the mirror was unfamiliar, etched with the marks of regret and loss. The past few days had been a blur. David had moved out. He had packed his things, left the house that had once been their home, and walked away without looking back. The sound of his footsteps had echoed in her ears long after he was gone, each one marking the death of something they had built together. Lena had hoped, desperately, that there would be a moment where he would turn around, come back to her, tell her it was all a mistake, that he could forgive her. But that moment never came. It was as if the finality of his departure had slammed the door on any hope she had left, and now she was here, alone. Standing in the aftermath of everything she had lost, she let out a shaky breath, trying to steady her mind. It was easy to get lost in the whirlwind of what-ifs, but she knew better now. There were no more second chances, no more promises of fixing what was broken. She had shattered it all, and the pieces were scattered too far to put back together. Lena picked up her phone, scrolling through her messages. There was one from Jackson, as always. "I've been thinking about you. Hope you're okay." The words felt like a lifeline, but she knew better than to reach for it. She had already made her choice, or rather, had it made for her. She couldn't keep running to him, couldn't keep hiding in the illusion of something that wasn't real. She was tempted, of course. The part of her that longed for escape, for validation, for something to make her feel alive again, screamed to reach out. But deep down, she knew it wasn't Jackson she was seeking. It was herself. And Jackson could never give that back to her. It wasn't just David she had betrayed. It was herself. The choices she had made had not only fractured her marriage, but had chipped away at the woman she once was. She wasn't sure who she was anymore or what kind of person she had become. But one thing was certain. The road to recovery wasn't going to be easy. There were no shortcuts, no quick fixes. It was going to take time, and she didn't know if she had the strength to face it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she walked toward it, unsure of who could be standing there. She opened it to find her mother, standing with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought I'd come check on you," her mother said softly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I can't even imagine what you're going through." Lena didn't know what to say. She wanted to cry, to tell her everything she was feeling, but the words stuck in her throat. She felt as if she had nothing left to give, as if everything inside her had been drained. "I messed up, Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I ruined everything." Her mother wrapped her arms around her, holding her tight as the tears that had been building for days finally fell. Lena cried in her mother's arms, the sorrow and regret washing over her in waves. She didn't have the answers, didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something other than guilt. She allowed herself to grieve. When the tears finally subsided, her mother pulled back, her gaze filled with a mixture of concern and love. "You can't undo the past, Lena, but you can choose what comes next. You don't have to carry this alone." Lena nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. She didn't know if she could ever fix the damage she had done, but her mother's words lingered in her mind, a small flicker of hope in the midst of the darkness. "I don't know what's next," Lena said quietly, "but I have to face it. I have to live with what I've done, but I can't keep running from it." Her mother smiled, a soft, sad smile. "That's a good first step." Lena nodded, wiping her eyes. The future was uncertain and the road ahead would be long. But for the first time in days, she felt like she could take a breath. She didn't know if she would ever be able to fix things with David. She didn't know if she could rebuild what they had. But she knew that this was her moment, her chance to change, to grow, and to find herself again. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were no guarantees. But it was the only chance she had left. What do you think of Lena's journey and the choices she made? Do you think she can rebuild her life after everything that's happened? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And if you're looking for more heartwarming tales, make sure to check out our other videos by clicking here on the end screen.